So here we're going to talk a little bit about classic ethical theories. These are theories in the history of philosophy and the history of ethics that help to crystallize some of our positions on things and will kind of give us some structure as we're talking about some of the moral issues that we get to later on in the course. Your book presents three major theories: virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and consequentialist ethics. So we're going to go through those three in turn. The first one is virtue ethics. First thing we need to talk about is that distinction between being and doing. Ethics can be looking at an individual's moral choices, what an individual actually does in a given situation, but it can also look at the moral formation of the individual. And as we talked about in the first couple of videos, really what ethics is about creating character within a person, right? It's creating a person that's going to do what's morally right. So, in some sense, ethics ought to be about being. It ought to be about creating a good person of good moral character. But in another sense, we also use ethics to evaluate moral actions. And so in that case, ethics is more about doing. It's about looking at a moral action, like the case studies that you've got here in your textbook, and saying whether what the moral course of action is to do. What's the right thing to do in the situation. So, virtue ethics is focusing on this being element. Basically, what a virtue ethic says is that if you practice virtue, if you follow these virtues that you can really understand through your reason, we actually have kind of an innate knowledge of what virtue should be. If you follow virtue, you'll end up being a virtuous person. You'll end up making the right moral choices. The idea is that once you become a virtuous person, you will act virtuously. So this guy down here is Aristotle. Aristotle put forward probably one of the first virtue ethics in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics. This was a letter to his son Nicomachus about how his son ought to live his life. And basically what Aristotle says is that if you live a virtuous life, you will be happy in the end. You'll reach a state of what Aristotle calls eudaimonia, or fulfillment and happiness. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So, how do you do that? Well, for Aristotle, you practice virtue by following your reason. If you're following reason rather than your emotion or your appetites, then you're more likely to do what you know to be morally right. So, for example, I know that I could stand to lose a few pounds, right? And I know that driving through the Wendy's drive-thru this afternoon and picking up a gigantic cheeseburger is probably not good for me. But when I drive past that Wendy's drive-thru, I have this urge, right? This hunger to pull into the drive-thru and order myself, a double bacon cheeseburger, a Baconator, or something like that. If my reason is working, I know that this is not what I should be doing, so I won't go into that drive-thru. And I'll go home and make myself a nice salad. If my appetites are working, then I follow that appetite, right? I follow that emotion, that craving, and get that burger. When we make poor moral choices, in a lot of cases, we're doing it because our appetites are winning, because our appetites have taken control of our reason. And this is the fundamental insight of Aristotle's virtue ethic. So what we need to do is control those appetites, build up our reason, and build up our own practice of virtue. So this is one core moral theory. The next two have to do with doing rather than being. It has to do with whether or not, in determining whether or not an action is morally good or morally bad. And these two ethics look at actions in different ways. One approach to action is a deontological approach to an action. And a deontological ethic says that the only thing we really have control over in an action is our intention going into the action. So I have control over what I'm going to do and what I think and what moral principles I'm using with this action. I don't have control over any of the outcomes. So if I make sure that my will, right, my moral principles are good, then ultimately the outcomes don't matter. I'm responsible for my own actions, for my own principles. So, for a deontological ethicist, an action is morally right or wrong if the person that is acting based upon sound moral principles. Some actions are right or wrong in and of themselves, and the ends for a deontological ethicist cannot justify the means. Your book talks a lot about Jack Bauer in 24, and in a sense, that's a great example, because in 24, Jack Bauer is constantly violating deontological ethics. He's doing things that are morally wrong because he believes that he's going to get a better result out of it. He's doing it for the good of the country. So a deontological ethic will look at intent, but it will kind of bracket out circumstance because and consequences, because really we have no control over them. A utilitarian ethic, which is the next ethic we're going to look at, or a consequentialist ethic, does just the opposite. The consequentialist ethic says, look, it doesn't matter what the person meant to do. What matters is what ultimately happens. What matters is the end result. So a consequentialist ethic is totally outcome driven. An action is good if the action produces good results. And so in this case, the ends can justify the means. For a consequentialist, Jack Bauer is totally justified in beating up on an interrogation subject because he's going to get information that could save hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Consequentialism works based on something called the greatest happiness principle. And it's the idea that an action should be doing the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. And if that's happening, the action is likely morally right. The two major thinkers associated with consequentialism, and there have been a lot over the years, the kind of originators of this idea, though, are Jeremy Bentham, who's this guy on the right, and John Stuart Mill here on the left. So, for what we're going to be doing with medical ethics, the fact is we're going to look at all of these things. And I think this is really a healthy way to think about ethics. I think when you bracket out consequences and you say those don't matter, you end up using your principles to justify a whole lot of things that shouldn't be justified. When you don't focus on forming yourself as a virtuous person and only focus on actions, you become kind of robotic in your decision making. And when you're only focusing on results and consequences, this can lead you to do some terrible things, some things that are absolutely morally reprehensible because you're focusing solely on those consequences. So we need to pay attention to all three. We need to have virtues, we need to build character, we need to make our decisions according to moral rules and moral principles, but then we also have to pay attention to the consequences. The next step for you is to take a look at the survey that's in the book at the end of chapter 1 that goes through and asks you a bunch of questions to determine what your moral bias is, whether you're more of a virtue ethicist, a deontological ethicist, or a consequentialist ethicist. And I look forward to the conversation on this in the forums.